The third capability would be community preparedness and participation. I mean, it's somewhat of a restatement of the obvious. If communities aren't prepared, we are going to have huge problems. If the individual in the household do absolutely nothing to prepare for an EMP attack or any other kind of disaster, which we saw that in New Orleans, we've seen that in Florida, we've seen that other places. If the individual or household's not prepared, there's really very little at that point that local, state, or federal government can do, because it's pure catch-up at that point. You're just trying to fill in for what should have already occurred that did not. And so, one of the things that gives me the greatest amount of kind of heartburn is for, 2 years, I think now, no, it was in 2005, in May, Gallup went into Florida. And anybody remember back in September of '04, you had those 4 hurricanes hit Florida one after the other?
Yes, I live in Florida, I know.
There you go.
I remember them well.
Yeah, well, Gallup went down to those areas and actually did a poll to figure out what people had done to prepare for that hurricane season that was going to start. And what they found was 83% of people that had been hit by 4 straight hurricanes 6 months before had done absolutely nothing to prepare for the next hurricane season. And if so, when you think about something as real as a hurricane, which we know are gonna come, they happen with regularity, or tropical storms, however you want to phrase it, and people don't do it, 83% of people do very little. How do we raise the bar when you think about something that is, so not talked about, hypothetical in some cases as an EMP attack? People don't even know what that stands for, let alone what it is, what it can do. So you really have a high bar to try to figure out how do we get folks aware, and this is the kind of conference that is the start of that, getting outside the Beltway and really trying to educate folks over the heads of Washington to make sure people think and start maybe taking some action. And it really is the only realistic option. There will be no other resources available in an EMP attack. So if the individual and household's not prepared, then the community is going to be at a loss, frankly. The fourth capability is shelter in place. Again, because of the pure spread of an EMP attack, because of the sheer population numbers in the United States, and because of the densities of some of those populations, there is going to be absolutely no public shelter for people to go to. There's just simply you will have no capacity to have stadiums or any those types of things, full of food, water, blankets. That's just not going to happen. And so the only option we have is really shelter in place. So we need to make sure that we've put together at the local level the shelter in place parameters and requirements, so people know what's expected of them and can do what they need to do to be able to handle that. The fifth would be critical resource logistics and distribution. This is one of those things where, assuming we can get folks to prepare for the first 72 hours or first 7 days, right, which is probably more realistic, it's going to be 7 days or longer before there's really any help that comes in. If you can do that, you then have to make sure that you actually have a logistics and distribution system of some sort in place, so that whether it's the state or it's the federal government, or frankly more likely international countries, can bring aid to bear to get that aid from wherever it is to wherever those communities. If you don't have kind of mapped out and figured out how you're going to create that logistics and distribution channel absent technology, you're going to be in a world of hurt in order to replenish, as folks are running out of food and water and those types of things, the kind of things they need in order to avoid mass casualty situations. So that's one of those key things. And as I said, my sense would be if we in fact get an EMP attack, the likelihood is we're going to be heavily reliant upon international support in order for us to actually get what we need to effectively weather the storm and figure out how to start rebuilding those communities one by one, month by month, year by year, decade by decade. The sixth one would be environmental health. And in that, specifically dealing with three really key issues. One are your vulnerable populations, elderly, disabled, and what I consider the dependent community, folks that are almost entirely dependent upon government, not necessarily physically or from an age standpoint, but just the mentality is dependency. Government is there to do those. Those folks will have done nothing, and we saw that in New Orleans, where there was a segment of the population that they are dependent upon government and had done very little to actually be ready for New Orleans in that hurricane. So we got to make sure that we have figured out a way to think through and identify our vulnerable population so that we can make sure we go out and find them. There was anybody see the New York Times Sunday? the New York Times Magazine. Anybody read the story about Memorial Hospital? Let me see that. If you didn't, go online and Google Memorial Hospital, New Orleans, New York Times Magazine. It's a pretty long article, but boy, I tell you, it is a really good piece of reporting that talked about what happened at Memorial Hospital after Katrina happened, and after days and days of promises that they'd be there to evacuate those folks that were the critical care patients and nobody came, you started seeing mass euthanasia essentially going on. And so really key issues that are going to be things that we have to struggle through and think through. So if we don't have a plan, we're going to see more of that self-help kind of stuff occur. And then in addition to that, we also have to think through things like as food rots because there's no refrigeration and people have waste, they're just going to throw it outside. Oh, what's going to happen, right? You're going to see rats and other types of animals starts coming to that. And what comes with rats? Well, it seems silly to talk about, the Black Death in, centuries ago, but that's fundamentally how that spread and occurred was, back then people just threw stuff out their front doors into the streets and the animals came to get it and they spread the diseases that way. So we really need to make sure we figured out what we do with all of this waste stuff that's going to, rotted food and other things, or we're going to get those secondary and tertiary effects of disease and types of plague epidemics that might occur that really start going after the population. So again, you got to think through those environmental health. Related to that, water, right? We can live without food for a good long time. Can't live without water. So if we can't figure out a way to make sure people get water, you're going to have that same problem of they're going to start dying for lack of water. And then, of course, the third element of that is sanitation, right? If people can't, all those sanitation plants are dependent upon power. If they're not up and running, you can just imagine what that's going to do. And again, the disease element that starts spreading and all the things that go with that and cascading effects. The seventh would be search and rescue. Okay, same concept. If we don't have in place a plan at our community levels, so how we're going to, who are the vulnerable populations, and how are we going to go out and identify and bring those folks that truly need help, right, into some type of place, then we're going to have, what occurred in New Orleans, and even worse. Anybody see what happened in France a few years back when they had a heat wave, a little teeny heat wave? And what happened in Paris? How many people died? 30,000 people died in Paris, a modern country, because there's actually not a lot of air conditioning, but mostly those were old folks that were sitting in their homes and just the heat got so hot they dehydrated and just died. I mean, we can't let that happen, and so we've got to think through the search and rescue capabilities and how we go about doing that to make sure that does not happen here. And then the eighth capability would be mass care. This gets into, once again, assuming we have prepared communities, and you can get the logistics supply chain coming in, how do you then go about making sure we get food, shelter, clothing, all the things that are going to have to be given to folks as that day turns into a week and week turns into month. So we're going to have those issues, and we've got to think through those. So if you've done a good job as a community and you figured out 1 through 8, then you get to 9 and 10, which really gets into the fundamental recovery issues of restoration of lifelines and economic and community recovery. And that really is one of those things where that is not a conversation about months or years. That is a decades long. I heard somebody mention, I think 2 panels ago, about the bartering system, and that's going to come back. Now, I'm not so sure that's right or not. I think it's so hard for us to even know. But what we do know is it's going to take decades for a country, a modern country, hit with an EMP that covers half the geographic area to actually recover in a manner of decades. I mean, you have to just truly rebuild so much that it's going to be just a massive task. And then with that, you obviously are going to be faced with a lot of stark choices, finite resources, and in that case, very finite resources. And so figuring out where you're going to allocate those finite resources to restore that community is going to be a really vital conversation. And so those are kind of the 10 capabilities. And if you go to the target capability list, again, Google it, and you'll find a document all over, it's like 600 pages. But if you go to those, you can kind of peel back, and each one of them has, preparedness measures and metrics, requirements, all the types of things. Again, not a panacea, has a lot more work to be done on that document to get to the granularity that you really need for it to be truly useful. But it's a great start. You can see through what some of the things that you're going to have to struggle with as you think through this. And so just to kind of close, I mean, in some ways, if you think through what I just talked about, it seems unfathomable, doesn't it? I mean, how do you possibly deal with those 10, let alone all the other things I actually haven't talked about that are going to get into dealing with these things? And so think through that and figure out how we going to raise the bar of awareness and get not just people putting their head in the sand and say, well, man, I'll just got to hope and pray it never happens. As we defund missile defense, right? As we pull back our kind of security envelope, how, as this becomes a possible greater reality, how do we get folks to do something, take action and actually do something?